I'm Brent Carson. I have come here to do a program today here to the Myers Inn in Sunbury, and I appreciate you being a part of it with me as I was asked to do a program on the crimes and jails, or jails and crimes of Delaware County. I am a retired teacher, and I have worked on Delaware County history for many years and enjoy delving into different subjects. And so this was one I thought, might be of some interest anyway to people. So here we go. I want to talk a little bit about Delaware County's history regarding all of that. Way back as Delaware began, as the whole county began in 1808, there's oftentimes the thought that as far as jails and as far as crime was concerned, in the very beginning of the county, they had a saying that it was almost as difficult to break the law as it was to end up in jail. Well, the county was a wilderness. The settlers were scattered. The villages, what were villages, were so small that there really wasn't a lot of crime going on. And that's true. Such things as letting your geese or your hogs run wild. I know they spoke of the Bigsby's one time of hogs running wild through the house that weren't even their hogs. Riding too fast on your horse, faster than a trot. Trotting a horse was as fast as the law allowed in your small villages and towns of the county, because, of course, that was considered dangerous to go any faster than that for the pedestrians. Even when they put the first cars in, their first speed limit in the city of Delaware was 8 miles an hour. That matched the speed of a trotting horse, which they thought would be dangerous if you were traveling in a car faster than on a horse. But, here's one, going way back to the beginnings of the county, that I didn't know anything about this until just the last month or so. I was reading the township minutes of Berkshire Township, and in there they spoke of fence inspectors being hired by the township. And I thought, wow. Now that sort of struck me because I grew up on a dairy farm just west of Delaware. And we had a dairy farm, so the cows, we had to keep them in. Didn't always keep them in. I can remember a housing development behind our property that the cows would sometimes get out. The people were very nice about it. And over the years, occasionally our cows would wander away. So I thought fence inspectors, people hired to guarantee, not though for you to keep the cattle in. It was to keep the cattle out. Because in the very earliest part of this county, cattle ran loose. I know I've heard Polly Horn here talk of the fact that the main square right across the street from the Myers Inn was so surrounded by huge trees that green area that was always an open space was great for keeping different people's cattle in there. And they were all marked on their ears by the owner's marks so that they knew whose were whose. Well, but then you could go to further afield out into the small areas of the county. Having a field, a crop, was so important. So that, if you had a very small field of, say, corn that was very important to you, and you wanted to make sure that no cattle got in there, although the cattle roamed. I could see is where you could run into problems from one settler to another, saying, your cattle got into my corn, and that person who owned that piece of crop would say, that's your fault, and yet the other man might say, but you didn't have a good fence. And so the law was you had to keep up a good fence to keep the cattle out. So those were some of the early problems you might run into. Yet I also took that a little further. Yes, I know 1808 is when the county began, and you realize that within less than 3 months, they had already elected a sheriff for this county. Solomon Smith, and we'll be going back to him some, but anyway, they had a sheriff right off the bat here in this county. Now the thing is, though, you have a sheriff for a wilderness, not just the little village of Delaware, but for everybody in the county. A forest, and how you're going to be able to keep order in that county. But the settlers were so scattered. I did think, though, a little bit further on that idea that all there were crimes like I already mentioned. Well, but then on the other hand, I think of somebody like Benjamin Cook from Harlem Township, who arrives in this county at one point. It's one of the earliest settlers of that area, dressed in rags. I mean, he looked a mess. He looked like he had nothing. I'm sure, dirtied himself up a little bit. The reason being, the main reason being, that in traveling here, he was carrying a great deal of money under those rags. And he wanted to make sure that he wasn't attractive to a robber. And robbers were plentiful on your early roads. I even think of one time going into a tavern over in Pennsylvania, stagecoach stop. And they gave you the tour of this tavern, and they said one of the rules at that time when you stayed overnight in that tavern was that you would share the bed with strangers, and you also kept your clothes on, and your valuables, all valuables, had to be inside your clothing for your own safety, for fear of somebody stealing your money from you. So that would certainly have been a problem. I also think of the fact, though, that back in the early day, if the sheriff was that far away, and normally they didn't have deputies in that earliest time, how in the world is a sheriff going to be able to do anything for settlers farther away from just the village where he lives, in the city of Delaware? I even think of that problem when I think of the first doctor, Dr. Lamb. On one occasion, Dr. Reuben Lamb was living in the city of Delaware, the town of Delaware, and was called upon for help out into the wilderness of the county to someone. It took him 3 trips to get there, because the first 2 day-long trips took him in a circle right back to where he started. He could not find where he was going to. Well, if it was true for the doctor, I'm sure it would have been true for the sheriff. And that age-old saying of taking the law into your own hands was certainly something that had to be considered in your earliest times of this county. And I think of some examples on that. I think of Chate Yaranye, better known to the settlers, the early settlers of the area, as Leatherlips, the chief, the Wyandotte chief. Now this was actually just outside of what is today Delaware County, in Franklin County, over by Dublin. And I remember that incident of how 6 Wyandotte warriors came to the home of the early settler John Sells, demanding to know where this Leatherlips lived. And he could tell that they were not to no good. And that, and of course, he knew that he had better be careful because he himself could be in danger. So he told them where he was. Leatherlips had been a friend of some of the settlers in the area and was against the Confederacy also of Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief. And the talk was that he had enough influence that they needed to get rid of Leatherlips. So they trumped up the charges of witchcraft and put him on trial. These 6 warriors put him on trial The next day, when Sells arrived with a number of other settlers that he had rounded up, he saw the trial already going on, and yet he really didn't interfere, nor did the others. And in the end, they condemned Leatherlips to death, and they didn't intervene. They didn't intervene because even though they outnumbered and had more weapons, the better weapons than your American Indians who were there, they knew better than to interfere because they're in isolated cabins. What are they going to do? Call the sheriff? Have him come out? Of course not. They knew that they were under their own protection. And they might get rid of this and solve the problem now. But what happens some evening when others come to get revenge and come to their cabin to kill their family? So of course, law taken into your own hands sometimes had to be at that time in history, depending upon what was going on. I think also of Shannon. This man Shannon, out near what is today the little village of Bell Point. There's a small stream that goes into the Scioto River right there. And it was a stream called Wolf Creek. Had a good name because there were plenty of wolves around there. And wolves brought a high bounty. Shannon decided to trap wolves and turn them in for money. And he had his trap set. For a while that was working, but then he noticed that he'd go back to check his traps and there was nothing caught. And he thought, but there's activity around here, why not? Well, he finds out that somebody is stealing his wolves. Well, was he going to go to the sheriff? Of course not. The sheriff's not going to be able to do anything about this. Instead, he waits for something to happen. And sure enough, in this case, it was a Wyandot Indian who came and was stealing his game from the trap, at which case he took it into his own hands. And Shannon shot and killed the American Indian, the Wyandot, put him in his own canoe, sent it on downstream where the Wyandots found their companion, and then they came looking for Shannon. End of the story. End of the story, because we never knew Shannon's last name. We never knew whether or not they caught him, whether or not he got away. The end of the story. And then I too think of way up in Thompson Township, up in that far northwest part of Delaware County, and the Tewa Indians of that area. They were a group that were not living there, but were traveling through the area and were hunting and crossing this man's land. And he decided, well, some of the neighborhood didn't appreciate this. And anyway, later they found the evidence of the remains of those Tewa Indians in a fire right there. Was there a conviction? Did the sheriff arrest these men? He couldn't prove it. And so there again, they decided that justice was in their hands and not of somebody else's. That's what they considered justice. I think of the last Indian, as we would have called them back then, the American Indians, the last one who was probably a Wyandot, perhaps not, who was killed near the city of Delaware. He had come to Delaware a lot. He was well liked by the people, but one night north of Delaware, along what was known as the Horseshoe Creek, two ruffians, as they were described, went out and from the top of a cliff shot and killed that man, ending the life of the last American Indian living in that area. Did they arrest him? You were long before the type of evidence that they could prove who had done it, although everybody seemed to know who had done it and were not happy because of all that. So there were all kinds of incidents that were out in the county and around this county where you had people taking the law into their own hands. I think too, once the town starts, they had a teacher who was teaching on the main corner of the city of Delaware, where today the city hall stands, the city building stands. And of course, he was not a public education teacher because it was prior to that time. It was very early on in the town, and teachers would come and go who would hire themselves out to teach some children if they paid them. Well, this man was considered quite mean. And at one point, as the description said, he beat the child to death with a stick in his class. And the description in the history book said, but he did not stay in town very long as he was chased out of town. I don't know if he was tarred and feathered or not, or just chased out of town. You mean he wasn't put on trial for murder? No, he was out of town. In those very early days, different ways of dealing, I guess, with crime. That was some of those incidents that would have happened way back in our very earliest time in our history. But as towns began to grow, of course, in the role of Solomon Smith, the first sheriff, well, let me even mention just a little bit about him. He comes here from New Hampshire. He'd been in the Revolutionary War. He comes here and he's a school teacher. But within those first couple months, he's elected sheriff by 16 votes and then serves as sheriff from 1808 to 1818. The sheriff, or it's 1860, the sheriff, first sheriff of the county. That doesn't mean he gave up school teaching. Although he taught school on the side, sheriff, being sheriff, was sort of the sidelight. In fact, in his life, he ended up doing many things besides being sheriff. He was the justice of the peace. I guess the justice of the peace is similar to the sheriff in some ways, but he was also a sheriff, a person who could be like a minor judge, I guess, with duties of marrying people and so forth. But justice of the peace, the second postmaster, the county auditor, the county treasurer, the grand master of the Masonic Lodge, one of the original founders of the Episcopal Church in the town. And then he went on to become one of the original commissioners of the Mad River and Lake Erie Railroad, which was the second railroad in the state of Ohio. So he was an active person, not just the sheriff of the town. When I think of that, then I also think of all through our history, most of the sheriffs who were chosen in the town's history or elected, their main profession had not been being a sheriff. In fact, I think only until most recently. I know that Steve Martin, the sheriff of Delaware County today, did come from a whole background of rising up through law enforcement. But that wasn't normally the case back in through our history. I'll give you an example. I would like to read you a list of what some of these people did for a living. We had a grain elevator operator, a home construction person, a worker in a car shop, selling farm equipment, farming, business people, a Baptist minister, an engineer of the fire department, a painter, a hotel clerk, a coroner, and restaurateurs, all different main professions of people who became sheriffs in this county over the years. I don't want to get too far away, though, without talking about, well, what about the jails? Were there jails in this county? Well, of course there were. From the very beginning, from 1808, Delaware, the county seat, the city of Delaware, had a jail. I asked Polly Horn, did Sudbury ever have a jail? And she said, well, the town hall, there in the square, the same one today, at one point, the southeast corner was a place where they held prisoners. Yes, there was that jail, but I've checked all over the county, and there have not been jails in other villages or towns in Delaware County, other than Sudbury. And then the city of Delaware has had, of course, the city jail for the city police, but also the sheriff had a jail. or there was a jail in the city for the sheriff. From the very beginnings. In the very beginning, there was a jail built on what we call, today it's the main walk of the university, going up past right there that ends where the city fire station is, there at the small city park, right there. It would have been on the, I guess I could officially call it the Jaywalk, as they call that walk for the students there at the university. Jaywalk and South Franklin's, South Washington Street, right at the top of that hill, overlooking the background of the Delaware Run. Well, that's where a wooden jail was built. They said it was so flimsy that the prisoners were constantly escaping out of the roof of the jail. It was a wooden, perhaps log jail. They'd escape through the roof, and then they said that they would regularly stand on the roof, crow like a rooster, and then run away. Well, that jail didn't last very long. They then built a stone jail right near it, and it didn't last very long. And they then built another jail. It was more like a barn-like structure that was even more secure. I'm not sure if it was at the same location or had moved to a different location at that point. So there were other jails, and then eventually they came to the fact that jails were considered so bad that they needed something better. And I read this description from the Delaware Gazette back in 1870s. And it says, this is from a visitor coming to Delaware. This morning, while waiting train time, we toured the town and saw the jail. Like the many and beautiful residences found in and around Delaware, the jail has a very desirable location. It stands on the crest of a hill and not on the low, damp, cheerless sites. This, with excellent arrangements for light and ventilation, secures health and light to its inmates. Pure air, genuine oxygen, and the light of the sun are common blessings in which all, in jail and out, have a divine given right. Your jail is built to hold its inmates. In our rickety old and some of our new jails, plans to escape become a mania among the prisoners. They think of nothing but how to work their way out. Your massive, compact, and strong walls settle the question, so it could never be a disturbing element in the thoughts and minds of the Delaware prisoners. I have here for you an annual report of the Board of the State Charities in 1869 called the Prison Pens of Ohio. It says, our state today supports seminaries of crime. In our jails linger more barbarism than in all of our state institutions combined. It went through 11 counties in this report, picking them out, although they said there were many others as well, described most of them as having no light, no ventilation, contaminated water. Allen County, grand juries condemned it for 16 years. Jefferson County, damp, dark, and otherwise horrible in all its features. Trumbull County is utterly, undesirably mean. Well, it went on and on describing these. But as that person had said, but not in Delaware County. In Delaware County, they described the jail. Now, let me go back to that for a minute. I showed you there, as I was reading that, the old jail that still stands in Delaware County, over in Delaware, behind the old historic courthouse. And that is the structure that has most recently become the possession of the Delaware County Historical Society for preservation. I say that now, though, to mention this. That was not the jail that this visitor to Delaware was describing. He was instead describing the fourth jail that Delaware built. About 20 yards to the north of that structure you just saw, 20 yards to the north of it was the stone structure of a jail that was considered good, decent, as compared to many of the other jails of Ohio. Well, that was torn down, and then in 1878, they built the jail that I just showed you. And they built it according to the front. It's 1878. It was actually opened in the spring of 1879 is when it actually opened. But gives you an idea of what jails were like. And by the way, the person who reformed so much of this idea of changing the jail system in Ohio and nationally was a man who was Delaware's own, Rutherford B. Hayes. He was very big back when he was governor of Ohio into changing the way jails were run and built. And he in particular was pushing for that reform. He in fact also had that idea that in a jail, staying in that jail should be the sheriff and the family. One part of it is the family, one part of it is the jail. And I will come back to that. But it's time for right at the moment, crimes. We've talked about crimes, but what about as the town and county began to grow, what was going on? One that I think of is, you go back to those Wild West. Roger Roberts is here, and he and I are old enough to remember, excuse me, and many of you maybe too, who are watching this, back to the days when you had the Westerns on TV, and all of those, Wyatt Earp, the sheriff. Remember also, and they used to talk about on some of those shows occasionally, there'd be a lynching about to take place. They were going to overrun that jail, get the prisoner out, and hang him there, and the sheriff's trying to stop the hanging. Did that ever happen in this county back in those days? As far as we know, no. Now, it wasn't just the horse thieves of the West who were being hung and so forth. There's also, of course, African Americans during that era, and in Ohio, not just in the South, but in Ohio, there were lynchings going on of African Americans. The only lynching that I have heard of being attempted there was an African American held in the old county jail. I'm not sure the year when this took place. I'm going to say the very early 1900s. But anyway, there was talk of people coming in trying to get him out to lynch him. And the sheriff had him moved to a different county. So it never happened. In that case, it never happened. As far as we know, it didn't happen in this county. But yes, there was that question. And as far as other things going on, though, at that time, saloons, drunkenness. You think of the Wild West? We have a picture of a street in Delaware called Winter Street, East Winter Street from Sandusky up to our next block, and that picture taken in the 1800s looks like that could be Dodge City, Kansas, or something like that, back in the days of the Old West. And that there were saloons and lots of problems with drunkenness in Delaware. One of the streets in Delaware that in the late 1800s, with the building of the railroads, we brought in lots of crews of people working on railroads and working in the shops. And that became an area near the railroad station on the east side of Delaware, east of the river, near the train station, what is today Lake Street. That little stretch in there was at one time called Railroad Street. And I saw a report one time where there had been numerous fights in the last 2 weeks out in the street, and one person murdered, stabbed to death in the street out there in that area. Well, There were also, of course, all kinds of things that you could get yourself into trouble for in this county. Here's one, 1879. It was reported in the paper for the Delaware Gazette that in Delaware, Ohio, the city, in Delaware, Ohio, there had been 9 robberies, house robberies, that week. 9 break-ins. Remember the time period way back in history when you didn't lock your doors? When you didn't feel any need to lock your doors of your house? But there were times when, of course, people weren't locking their doors, but that didn't mean that they didn't have any burglaries. In this case, they were rampant on burglaries. And in fact, there was a burglary taking place down along Park Avenue. They're near that same little park that I mentioned. And the person saw the guy, caught the guy, started to chase him from a distance, and he turned and fired 4 shots at him, nearly missing his head, and they later caught up with him. But that was a time period of a lot of robberies going on there in the town. But I saw this also. There were crimes of body snatchers from cemeteries for science. And they would steal them and sell them for the use in science. There had in fact been a cemetery in Delaware City where the football field at Ohio Wesleyan stands today. And when that cemetery was there was at one point a gunfight between the sheriff and some grave robbers hiding behind the tombstones, trying to catch these grave robbers from taking the bodies. Well, here's one from Radnor. They weren't all that type of thing, because listen to this. Radnor, somebody from there wrote into the paper saying, "I see by your last issue that body snatchers are at work near Delaware. Here we have other snatchers. Chickens from the roost, potatoes and cabbage from the cellars, and corn from the crib. Someone left an overshoe in the mud, women's size 4 shoe. David Edwards said she can come and claim her shoe with no questions asked if she'd like." Well, what about big crimes? Biggest crime that ever hit the news in Delaware County was probably the red slipper crime. That was the murder that made national attention. And this was in 1953. And that crime was the red slipper crime, as they called it. The murder of a co-ed, a former co-ed of Ohio Wesleyan, who had been the girlfriend of a student who was still going to Ohio Wesleyan. She was already out of school. She was from White Plains, New York, and working in Cleveland. But she was sneaking down occasionally to see him. He claimed that he had not seen her for a long time. Well, come to find out, yes he had. And yes, he murdered her down on the street called Henry Street, which is near where the stadium is, in a shed that was there. He took the body to Wyandotte County, and there he disposed of it. And she was wearing red slippers. And finally a body was found in a woods out in the country, out in Wyandotte County, and the local sheriff, at that time, I believe he was the youngest sheriff in Ohio, who had just taken office. He solved the crime, was able to track down the red slippers were purchased in White Plains, New York, at a department store, and he even was able to track down the date. And at that point, they were able to finally track it back to Cynthia File, the name of the person killed, and that Ray Shanagley was the student who had actually finally admitted that he did it. I think, though, too, of a crime by a man by the name of Fred Cook. It was the biggest manhunt in Delaware County's history. It was involved the man, sheriff by the name of Harley Wardstaff, and I at the time was in grade school or perhaps junior high school, so it was about in the 50s. I'm playing baseball at Bingo Park. I'm practicing that day and see helicopters to the north of me. That was rare at that time to see helicopters around like that. And the coach came and told us that we needed to leave and go home, and that he wasn't going to, unless we had a ride or unless we had our bike and could get out of there right away, he wasn't going to leave us there. He said that there's an emergency that's come up, and it involves someone who's escaped, and that we need to leave. And it was just to the north of that area where the incident took place. There was the beating of a woman and tying up a couple women, I believe, by this prisoner, and then he escaped and was in the dam area north of Delaware, in what is the Delaware State Park area. They sent out the mounted deputies, which they had, and they also sent out they even brought in Boy Scout, Explorer Scouts in troops, and they walked through to try to get this person. And they didn't find him, and it became night, and they had still not found this man. And so the town was really in an uproar. People were scared to death that he was somewhere around, and that he was finally captured in Columbus. He had snuck through the area and gotten out, but that was the biggest manhunt. They said that there were hundreds of cars from Marion and Columbus and Delaware lining U.S. Route 23 north of Delaware, sightseers, as well as people looking for this person. I think, though, too, of this murder that took place. Now, you talk about the national news of the murder of the Red Slippers. Here's one, though, that goes back to 1879, and it says this, August 7th, 1879. It is part of the notes that every small village in the county would send their latest news to the paper about what's going on in our area. I mean, it might be Hyatt's. Such and such went to visit a friend up in Cleveland, and they will be back in another week. Somebody was born in Radnor. In their news, they might put down the Radnor news. Or somebody's building an addition on their barn. All types of little things. And buried in the Orange Township news for that week was this. There's been a mysterious murder down here lately. Now, this wasn't the main news of that township. I remember that there was news, I think, of some visitors from out of town who were staying in one of the homes. One of the people in the township made more news of this. It said there was a mysterious murder down here lately, which surprised not only the family, but the entire community. We allude to the taking off of Turk Ganong, who died on the 27th from a dose of poison administered by himself or someone unknown to any person. His remains were interred secretly by the family, but not before a careful inquest was held by the coroner, Taylor, living nearby, who rendered a verdict according to the above facts. That's it. There is no trial. There was nothing more ever mentioned in any of the papers about it. So if it was a murder, so much for that. Anyway, away from the crimes, and now I think of, what about the jail escapes? Well, I mentioned that historic jail that the Historical Society is now having the ownership of, and I think of how that, I've given a lot of tours there. We've asked a lot of questions and interviewed a lot of people regarding that. What was it like during that time period when the sheriff lived in the jail with his family, and in the back was the jail itself. What was that era like? And what about how safe was this? Keep in mind now, that's the 5th jail that was built in the city of Delaware, and each one was supposedly getting better and stronger as time went on. And yet, within the first few weeks or months after the jail opened, there was already escapes from that jail. There was an escape of several prisoners, while the deputy, when the sheriff was gone, Sheriff Sackett was gone, when the deputy went in to give some water to one of the prisoners, and they escaped, and while they were escaping, he made so much racket in being held by the prisoners, and then them escaping, that they forgot to lock him in the jail cell. So immediately upon the whole group of them escaping from the jail, he is out warning people, and the whole town almost became like the deputies as they were out searching for these people, and they caught them all and brought them back. There was another case where a prisoner twisted the bars off of this new secure jail and was able to escape that way. I also think of the case of a person that I have known over the years. That was, I mentioned earlier, a man named Harley Wardenstaff, who was a sheriff in this county, and in the 1950s, his son, Joe Wardenstaff, and Joe today goes by Jason, and Jason and I were discussing this, and I said, were there any escapes while you were there? He said, actually there was. There was an escape. He said, in fact, my father was out of the jail. I was a young teen at the time when this happened. And he said, my father put me in charge of the office while he's gone, because all the other deputies are out, and the sheriff was out. He said, so you run the office while I'm gone, and I took charge of the office, and all of a sudden I'm sitting there, and I'm looking out of the window of the jail, and down the drain pipe, outside, he sees a prisoner escaping. He's coming down, and he's panicking. He thought, what do I do? I'm not trying to stop him. Well, he didn't have to worry about that. He came down the drain pipe, and then he comes back in the jail. And he says to me, Jason Wardenstaff, he said to me, put me in with the other prisoners. I'm isolated upstairs and there's nobody to talk to. He said, put me in the regular jail. And so he did. He took him back and put him in the jail, but it wasn't actually an escape. It was just wanting to be with the other prisoners. Oh, and then there's this one. This was told to me by someone one year at the Delaware County Fair. He happened to be visiting here from Arizona. He didn't come back very often, but he came back every year for the fair, even though he had no relatives or really any friends much in Delaware. He just liked coming back. And we were talking at the fair one year. I ran into him there, and he said to me, I remember an incident that happened at the jail. He said, I was a kid. Now, I mean, I'm in grade school, and I'm not too far into grade school. And he said, and the jail used to be behind the old historic courthouse right there, as you know, and they had a big yard, and they would sometimes have summer concerts there on that yard, in that yard. And they were having a concert, and they would have like a social, and your family would come, and they'd bring food or get food there at the social. And anyway, we're sitting there watching, and I'm bored as a little kid. I'm more interested in what's going on around me than the band that's playing there on the lawn. And I'm looking around, I look up at the top of the jail, and I said to my dad, look at the back at the top of the jail. He said, I think some prisoners are escaping. And my dad laughed and he said, because of course they were workers, he was sure that we're up on the top. And he said, why don't you go over there and tell the sheriff? He's sitting right there with his family. No, I'm not going to tell the sheriff. No, go over and tell the sheriff. I'm not going to tell the sheriff. And so they just forgot about it. Next day, headlines in the paper. While the crowd was listening to the band, the prisoners are escaping from the top of the jail. And he only told, but he never told anybody. And he said, for the rest of our life, we talked about that incident. Had I just told the sheriff, things would have been different there. Well, I think of this also. You remember that old TV show, Andy Griffith and Mayberry? And you think, was that anything like our jail? The family living in the jail? Was there anything at all like that? And I think, well, in some ways, maybe a little bit. And here's an incident. The lady who's passed away not too long ago, Marge Rutherford, said that when she was a little girl, a real little girl, her name was Lambert, and her sheriff was Sheriff Lambert. We lived in the jail, and I liked to go down on the main street of town to buy candy at some of the stores. But I was too little to do that. I couldn't go down there by myself. And sometimes my father and mother got busy, and they couldn't take me down. So my father, the sheriff, would go to the jail, get a prisoner, and get him out and say, take my daughter down and get her some candy downtown. And then when you come back, lock yourself in the jail cell. Those of you who would remember back to the days of Mayberry and Andy Griffith, remember the name of Otis, the prisoner who would get drunk on the weekend, and then he would come in and lock himself in the jail and spend the night. They had a bed for him there, and he'd sleep in the jail. It almost sounded like, in that incident, with Marge Rutherford and the prisoner, of sounding like Mayberry back in those days. Well, I want to end it, though, with this. Two incidents which involved me. And when I think of crimes and sheriffs and deputies and police in this county's history, I think of two incidents. One was on the main street of Delaware. This is quite a number of years ago now. I'm into the sporting goods store on Sandusky Street, and I'm shopping for something there. I remember very well that in the store at the time was the owner, whom I knew well, and his wife, who was also working there, and their nephew. There was also a young couple who were over there shopping, and an individual man who was also a young man who was also shopping. In a little bit, there before very long, the owner went to the back of the store while I'm looking around, and then I finally find something to buy, and I'm up at the counter with his wife, and here he comes from the back of the store, the owner, and he said, lock the front door, and he, in fact, tries to get over to the door. Well, first of all, he goes to the young couple, and he said, I've been watching on the camera in the back, you are shoplifting. Stay where you are. I've already called the police department, which is a half a block away, but they're on their way. Well, the woman panics and she runs out the front door. He then locks the front door and runs to the back of the store. Her boyfriend runs to the back of the store. He can't get out because the door is locked back there already. He can't get out the front door, and the owner starts back to where this man is, and then the owner comes running back and says to us, get down, he has a gun. There's a robbery. And he has a gun, and he has it out. So we get down behind the counter, and the nephew, his wife, myself, and he goes back to confront this burglar, or this man who is shoplifting. Meanwhile, we are under the counter with the cash drawer open, And down on the floor, out in front of the store, are a couple of people whom I happen to know, and they are looking in the showcase window, and then I know they spot me and they're waving. They're waving to me. And I'm waving back under the cash register. And later, in the end, by the way, the man who had the gun with a chair broke out the back door, trying to escape across the parking lot, and the police came and tackled him to the ground. By diving, one of them dove across the hood of a car, tackling this man and capturing him before he got away. The other customer who'd been at this store, he got out and quickly followed the other woman, and he stopped her before the police got there and had her. Meanwhile, we didn't know this had happened, that he had escaped and were under the counter. And this couple later asked me when they saw me, "What were you doing under the cash register with those people there in that store?" And that's when they learned that there had been a robbery there. The other incident that I end with regarding crimes and jails and sheriffs of Delaware County is this one. I mentioned there a little bit ago about Mayberry. And I am standing on the corner of Winter and Sandusky Street on one nice day, and a friend of mine from New Jersey is here visiting. He's an old college friend, and we're standing there on the corner talking, waiting for the light to change. And he lived, by the way, just outside of New York City, and every day he would take that train into New York City, that city that never sleeps, and would work there and then ride home each day into New Jersey. He's out here visiting me in this small town, and we're standing on the corner, and a police car pulls up beside me, waiting for the light also. And I look over and I notice the policeman is waving to me, he's smiling. And in the back seat is a prisoner. And he's leaning forward, and he's waving to me, and he's smiling. And this friend of mine says, "What is that all about?" He said, "Don't tell me you know them." I said, "Oh yeah, I know them. They were both former students of mine." And he said, "This really is Mayberry, isn't it?" On that note, I think I'll end this discussion, and thank you all for being a part of this program today.